Who was Ibn Arabi? What is Ihsan al-Kamil? What is Wadat al-Wujud? Who was Rumi? What is Tariqa and Silsila? Describe the plot and meaning of The Conference of the Birds. What are some ways Sufi practices are incorporated into wider Islamic cultures? What is a maqam? The earliest forms of Islamic mysticism that we can call Sufism emerged from the fringes of classical Islamic society. Women, Shiites, the enslaved, the poor. Sufism materialized as a kind of mirror image to the formal schools of Islamic thought, the madhabs, the schools of kalam, and the schools of philosophy. The more early medieval Islam came to be defined on one side by the most literate and the most wealthy members of Islamic society, the more the Sufis came to the fore as the defenders of folk Islam. Islam isn't supposed to be about reading books, they say. It's about transcending human ignorance. It's not studying hadith, but refining your character. Not whether you can make a rational argument about God, but whether you love God. But that leads to a problem for the early Sufis. Sufism was interlocked with an anti-establishment or anti-social streak that it retains to this day. If early Sufism is a kind of protest movement of the lower classes, or a performance art to shame the elites and the religiously uptight, it follows that many people came to see Sufism as excessive, rebellious, or even anti-Islamic. It's one thing to have a critique of the wealthy or the powerful. It's quite another to have wandering, half-naked madmen preaching in front of your mosque. So, today's question. How do you rein in Sufism? How can the more extreme notions of the early Sufis be made palatable to Muslims across societal classes? Well, there are 3.5 ways that Muslims in the medieval and modern periods have done this. So, the first way to make Sufism a little less crazy? Make it perfectly rational. Apply the same kinds of methods to Sufism that the philosophers and the theologians use. Rationalism, science, and demonstrable arguments. The most famous example of this systematic Sufism was created by the Andalusian mystic Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi was from a minor noble family in Murcia, which relocated to Seville when he was still a child. Somewhere in his youth, Ibn Arabi started to have visions of the prophet Jesus. Ibn Arabi's father took the boy to meet the local philosopher, Ibn Rushd, to try to make sense of what was happening to his son. Ibn Arabi, finding no use in the kinds of material insights the philosophers offered, instead turned to the path of the mystics, the Sufis. He started traveling around Spain and North Africa in search of notable Sufi sheikhs, and he went on the Hajj in the year 1201. Having a number of further visions in Mecca and elsewhere led Ibn Arabi to compose a number of treatises on how Sufism worked and paired, or not, with rational thought. Ibn Arabi's 2 most famous and influential arguments regard the nature of human perfectibility and the nature of God's oneness. The first of the 2 is Ibn Arabi's doctrine of the Ihsan al-Kamil, the perfect or complete man, the ideal human being. In the Quran, when God decides to make Adam, he says that he's going to make a caliph upon the earth. Now, Caliph here has a certain governmental meaning, like God is saying he's going to put a ruler on the earth. But there's a more literal meaning of Caliph as a placeholder. That is, when God calls Adam a Caliph, he's saying that this human being has something godlike about him. His relationship to the world is not dissimilar from God's own. In fact, that's kind of the role of the human being, to be the portal through which God acts and is present in the world. Although God is fully present in creation, in a perfected human being like Adam, or more importantly, Muhammad, God is immediately available. The Insan al-Kamil, the human being perfected, is someone in contact with the divine, who yet also presents the words and will of God on earth. Just as Muhammad can meet with God during his Miraj and speak the words of God in the Quran, so too can a perfected human being enter the reality of God and therefore demonstrate the love, justice, and presence of God on earth to other human beings. Sufism, then, is the process of perfecting humans, spiritual and intellectual practices that help people reach God and therefore make God more available to people everywhere. The Insan al-Kamil, like Muhammad or a saintly person, is a bridge that makes God available to the world and the world available to God. And this leads to Ibn Arabi's second major argument, called Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being. Ibn Arabi actually never uses this expression himself, but it is the typical shorthand for his worldview. It works like this. God is one and only one. God alone is God, and God alone can properly be called Allah, the divine being. But God has many other names and attributes. God is the knowing, the seeing, the compassionate, the friend, the hearing, the powerful, and so forth. But these kinds of divine names, knowing, seeing, hearing, powerful, can be applied to things that aren't God. We humans encounter knowledge and knowers, vision and seers, sound and hearers, power and the powerful. For instance, God is Al-Wadud, the loving or the affectionate one. Now, Tawheed, God is one and unique, right? But we encounter love and affection, Wadud, all the time in ourselves and in others. Now, we can understand this if we want as a kind of shirk, an association of the thing that we call love with the real love that is God alone. But Ibn Arabi sees it the other way around. God alone is Wadud, the loving. So when we see or feel love, we're actually experiencing God here and now. To see love or feel love, Wadud, is to encounter the divine. God alone is Wadud, and there is no other God. So, anything that is rightfully a presentation of Wadud must be a presentation of the one God. It's like God is hidden from us. But when we see someone truly loving, the veil between us and God, the lover, gets dropped so that for that moment we understand something of this loving God. And now we go one step further. God has lots of names. So when we see or are seen, we are in truth experiencing that God is the seer. When we feel power or witness something powerful, we're really experiencing that God is the powerful. And so it goes with all 99 names. All the divine names except for Allah, the God, since there's nothing else that can ever truly be called a God. And so the entire universe is presenting God to the human race constantly and in infinite ways. All we have to do is practice seeing the universe as a ground for God's self-exposure. That is, if you practice Sufism. It can help you see that the entire world is God's many names and attributes speaking to us. The Sufi is someone who focuses so much on the unity of God and the multiplicity of God's names and powers that they learn to experience God constantly, in everything, everywhere. Now, the influence of Ibn Arabi on Islamic thought was massive, and it still continues to this day. But again, most Muslims aren't scholars and don't express their Islam as a systematic worldview, like something you'd read about in a book. Most people's Islam would be more like a lived experience, or customs, or a way of life. That is, for most Muslims, Islam is something that you do. So, the second way that Sufism became a little less chaotic and scandalous was by turning into formal schools of Sufi practice and training. These are tariqas, Sufi paths. A tariqa is usually translated as a brotherhood or a Sufi fraternity. It's a fixed organization under a certain sheikh, a Sufi master, who helps the would-be Sufi by guiding their practice and meditation. It's sort of like the professionalization of Sufism. There are sheikhs, Sufi masters, who are professional mystics, people who are highly trained and practiced at understanding and experiencing God. And they guide other people, initiates, along this path. So Sufism isn't just a bunch of random people doing random things. Sufism is a series of these tariqas, formal Sufi organizations, each with their own practices, training, and sheikhs. Every one of these tariqas has a particular lineage, or silsila, that is, a chain of Sufi masters, sheikhs, stretching back over the centuries. My master learned his practice and way of thinking from his master, who learned it from his master, and so on, until the tariqa is traced back to a foundational figure. Beyond this foundational figure is Muhammad himself, usually traced back through Ali or Abu Bakr. So, in theory, these sheikhs aren't just making stuff up. These are long traditions of practices which supposedly go all the way back to the Prophet himself. There are hundreds and hundreds of these tariqas today, and each one has its own unique silsila, its line of spiritual descent. And each of these tariqas has a name, usually after a particularly important or influential sheikh. So here, let's just look at one of them, the Mevlevis. It starts with a man named Jalaluddin al-Balkhi, who is always called Rumi in English. Rumi was born in what is today Afghanistan, but following the arrival of the Mongols there around the year 1220, his family fled west as refugees. Rumi's family bounced around the Persian and Arab world for several years, and finally they settled down in 1228 in the old Christian Roman city of Konya, in modern Turkey. By the way, that's why they call him Rumi, the Roman. After his parents died, Rumi became a qadi at a local madrasa. He built a little name for himself and had a number of students, and all was going well for Rumi until, in 1244, he encountered a dervish, a Sufi wanderer, someone who moves from place to place in search of mystical insights, who would turn his whole world upside down and inside out. This dervish was Shams of Tabriz. A kind of mysterious and whimsical man, Shams spent years meandering across the Middle East, having strange mystical encounters. And the two of them, Rumi and Shams, quickly formed a deep friendship. For 4 years or so, Rumi and Shams discussed Sufism and practiced mystical rituals until finally, one day in 1248, Shams mysteriously disappeared. Now, what exactly happened to Shams remains a mystery to this day. Maybe he was murdered, maybe he ran away, Who knows? But what we do know is that Rumi went into a deep despair over the loss of his friend. Rumi started traveling around the Near East in search of Shams, but with no luck. And then finally, while he was in Damascus, Rumi came to a realization, here explained in one of his own poems. Why should I seek him out? I'm the same as him. He speaks through me. I've been looking for myself. Rumi, as evidenced by his large body of Persian poetry that survives, claimed that this loss and separation from one's beloved is in fact how God is known to us. Like Rumi was separated from his homeland as a child, and then separated from his friend Shams as an adult, Rumi argued that this is the heart of the human condition. The human, especially a Sufi, the one who loves God, has been separated from their beloved, the deity. We want to be reunited. And the pain and wonder of realizing how deeply you love something, only by being torn away from it, demands the Sufi find a way home again. That is, there's a bittersweet realization that you only love something after you've lost it, and because you've lost it, you want to find it again. After Rumi's death, his followers gathered together his mystical practices and poetry into a tariqa which followed his example. His followers called Rumi Maulana, our master, and in his honor, they started the Maulaiya Sufi order, or in Turkish, the Mevlevis. These are the Sufis that we refer to in English as the whirling dervishes. They have a distinctive form of dhikr, a way of remembering God, which takes the form of a spinning dance, which is accompanied by the poetry of Rumi set to music. By performing this ritual, the Mevlevis hope to commune with God by shucking off their worldly concern and losses, coming closer to their distant beloved. The Mevlevi order, though, is hardly unique. There are Sufi tariqas, each with their own dhikr and their own silsila, everywhere that there's Islam. In the subcontinent in Indonesia, members of Sufi tariqas number in the tens of millions. There are massive numbers of Sufis in the Arab world, in China too. In Chad, Niger, Cameroon, Ghana, and Liberia, more than a quarter of all Muslims also identify with at least one Sufi tariqa. In Turkey, more than half of all Muslims are a part of at least one tariqa. And in Senegal, a whopping 90% of all Muslims belong to a Sufi order. In fact, the power and influence of these Sufi tariqas has even been considered a threat by many more oppressive Islamic rulers. Sufi orders have occasionally been outlawed or even suppressed as a deviant interpretation of Islam. And conversely, the US government has actively sought to promote Sufi tariqas around the world as a means of combating violent movements. While Sufism has also been considered a kind of corruption in the Ummah with certain Muslim circles, elsewhere, the Sufis are the vanguard of Islam itself. The spread of Islam in India and Indonesia was more due to popular Sufi sheikhs and tariqas than any Islamic government. And in North America today, converts are far more likely to get drawn to Islam through a Sufi tariqa than any school of fiqh. Rumi, by the way, a Persian Turkish Muslim who died in 1273, is presently, as in today, the best-selling poet in the United States. Aside from systems of Sufi thought like Ibn Arabi's, or Sufi fraternities like Rumi's Mevlevis, there are other ways the more radical or antisocial tendencies of the Sufis got tamed. Another major way that Sufism was reformed for the wider public was in the form of fiction. Stories, songs, and poetry on Sufi themes are all over the Islamic world. Some of these are more implicit than explicit. The love story of Layla and Majnun, which exists in many poetic and musical forms, is, on the surface, a tragic love story. But just below the surface, it's an allegory of the relationship between the human, the lover, and the divine, the beloved. The anthology called The 1001 Nights, or The Arabian Nights in the West, is a massive series of Saj prose stories, many with coded Sufi messages and characters. But other Sufi literature is much more explicit about where it comes from, and attempts to explain Sufism in a form that's both palatable and pleasurable to your average Muslim. Perhaps the most notable example of this trend was in the poem written by Farid ad-Din Attar, a Sufi poet from Nishapur. By the way, he also was murdered by the Mongols who leveled Nishapur in 1221. Attar tells us the Sufi story entitled Mantik Ater, the Conference of the Birds, or the Dialogue of the Birds. It's an epic poem written in Persian ghazals, so it uses rhyming couplets throughout. The story begins with many species of birds from all over the world gathering together to decide who should be their ruler. The wisest bird, the hoopoe, tells all the others of the great Simorg, an immortal celestial bird of great power, wisdom, love, and beauty that lives beyond the edge of the world. Perhaps this great Simorg should be their ruler. The other birds agree with the hoopoe that they're all going to journey together to see this remarkable ruler of all birds, the Simorg. But then, the hoopoe starts to describe the journey that they're going to have to take to reach the Simorg. They have to fly across 7 valleys and run the risk of getting lost, eaten by predators, or dying of hunger or thirst. Many of the birds are scared off immediately, but some agree to follow the hoopoe into the realm of the Simorg. One by one, they cross the 7 valleys, and one by one, the birds are killed, die, or go insane. But the survivors struggle on their path until only 30 birds are left by the time they land at the home of the Simorg. And while they wait to see the Simorg, the 30 birds realize they're already in its presence. Si-morg in Persian means 30 birds. That is to say, they come to understand that the presence of the Simorg is found in each other. Their perfect, beautiful, beloved ruler only appears in the presence of this little ummah of birds who love, struggle, and work together on behalf of each other. So where's the Sufism here? The story is an allegory for the Sufi path. First, the human race, here the birds, realize that they are lost without God, their immortal, wise, and beautiful ruler who lives beyond our world. And so a wise person, either the prophet or a Sufi sheikh, in this case the hoopoe, tells us of the remarkable Simorg, basically God in the form of a bird. Together, these humans, or birds, must form a fraternity, a tariqa, literally a path, a way that we must all travel together as a group to go find God. But most aren't up to the task. They give up or fall short. But those Sufis, or birds, who follow their master all the way to the Simorg's abode, that is, into the presence of God, realize that God is only present when they search for their beloved together, as an ummah, or as a tariqa. People need each other and need to help each other to find God. We find God in each other when we live, work, fight, and love together and put aside our fears and limited selves in fana, a self-annihilation where one sees the beloved. So, strictly speaking, the Conference of the Birds tells you all you need to know about the teachings of the Sufis, just in coded terms. So, if you want, you can read the poem as a story about some birds and their adventures. Or, you could also learn the secrets of the Sufi way of life without necessarily having to join a tariqa or finding a sheikh. And finally, how can one practice Sufism without getting pulled into the antisocial madness and strange practices of the early Sufis? Well, you can systematize Sufi thought like Ibn Arabi. You can join up with a formal school of Sufi practice like the Mevlevis, the Tariqa of Rumi. You can approach Sufism allegorically in poems, songs, and stories like Attar's Conference of the Birds. Or, finally, you can practice Sufism without actually practicing Sufism at all. Across and around the Islamic world are religious practices that are not required of any Muslim by any school of fiqh, but were and are spread by the Sufis. So everywhere on earth where you see Muslims, most of whom are in no way Sufis themselves, you're going to see them doing things developed by Sufis. Here are some more of the more famous examples of Sufi practices that are practiced by non-Sufis. That is, Sufi forms of dhikr, remembrance of God, that are practiced by all sorts of people, Sufi and not. A particularly visible example of this sort of thing can be seen in the dhikr called tasbih, reciting a certain formula composed of divine names over and over again, a fixed number of times, over a sitting or over a day. When you see Muslims anywhere in the world using prayer beads, called misbah or tasbih, they are performing an act of Sufi dhikr, whether or not they're actually Sufis. These misbah, these prayer beads, are usually composed of 99 beads of various materials, one for each of the names of God. And the Muslim will run the beads through their fingers while they are saying, whispering, mouthing, or just thinking of divine names. And everywhere you find Muslims, you're going to see people just going about their days, running these beads through their fingers as they go. Are they Sufis? Maybe, but not necessarily. Very famous on the subcontinent, that is, in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, is Qawwali, a form of Sufi devotional music. In Qawwali, a group of musicians, usually between 8 and 10 people, sing, clap, and play harmoniums, tablas, and dholaks, while seated on the ground cross-legged. They sing devotional songs, usually in the form of ghazals, in various languages, but especially in Urdu or Hindi, Persian, Punjabi, and Bengali. This practice springs from the Chishti Tariqa, a Sufi brotherhood founded in Afghanistan. But now, Qawwali has been at least partially separated from its Sufi roots and become a kind of popular entertainment. You can see Qawwali music performed in stadiums in front of massive crowds comparable to any rock concert. For instance, check out this Qawwal by the famous Sabri brothers from Pakistan. Again, are the singers and musicians Sufis? Possibly, but not necessarily. But what about the audience? Well, they might be Sufis, but most of them are certainly not at all. But here they are, thousands and thousands of people gathered together to listen to Sufi music, Sufi and not. And again, across the whole Islamic world are maqams, or Sufi shrines, also called mazar, or in Persian or Urdu, dargah. These are the burial places of famous Sufi sheikhs. People make a pilgrimage called a ziyara to see these grave sites and say prayers there, whether the people who are praying are Sufis or not. While people might critique such practices as shirk, that is, treating a human being as a divine figure, even most Sufis themselves would reject that kind of thinking. Even if you're not a Sufi at all, it is probably beneficial to say a few prayers in the presence of one of God's dear friends. Who was Ibn Arabi? What is Ihsan al-Kamil? What is Wadat al-Wujud? Who was Rumi? What is Tariqa and Silsila? Describe the plot and meaning of The Conference of the Birds. What are some ways Sufi practices are incorporated into wider Islamic cultures? What is a maqam?